Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive. This time, we're going to be looking at something pretty interesting. I think something you brought to me that you've been exploring, and that is justification by faith, and specifically how it's presented in relation to God's actions.
Right.
And it looks like you've been reading some excerpts from Ellen DeKirsch, and this author frames the concept as a losing investment from God's perspective.
Yes.
And that's kind of a provocative way to put it.
Yeah.
So let's dive in and see what makes this author think this way. What I thought was really fascinating was the way that they use these financial and marketplace analogies to explain this complex theological idea.
Yeah.
So you're ready to get into it?
Yeah, let's get into it.
Okay, great. So this idea of a losing investment, I mean, it really jumped out at me when I was reading through the excerpts that you sent.
Yeah.
It's not every day that you see someone comparing God's actions throughout history to a series of bad business decisions.
It's true. There's a certain irony, I think, in using financial terms like losing investments to describe the actions of a divine being. But that's part of what I think makes the author's approach so compelling. They're sort of inviting us to consider a familiar concept like investment and apply it to something that seems to be beyond such earthly calculations.
It's like they're holding up a mirror to our human way of thinking and asking, what if we looked at God's relationship with humanity through this very specific lens?
Yeah.
And it definitely makes you think twice about this whole idea of divine grace.
It does.
So how does the author actually go about making this case? Where do they even begin?
Well, they start right at the beginning. They start with creation itself.
Okay.
Presenting it as kind of the first in a long line of what they call God's bad investments.
Wow. Okay. So right off the bat, they're making a pretty bold statement.
Yeah.
I mean, creation is often seen as this grand masterpiece, right? The ultimate act of divine power and love. But it sounds like the author is sort of hinting at something a little bit deeper here.
Right. They're not just focusing on the beauty and the majesty of creation.
Right.
But they're also focusing on kind of the inherent flaws and the potential for destruction that come built in, so to speak.
Yeah, and they waste no time in getting to that point.
Yeah.
Because they bring up the story of Cain and Abel very early on.
Right.
And they point out that even after giving humanity this incredible gift, I mean, the gift of creation itself,
Yeah.
God is met with violence and betrayal.
Right away. Yeah.
And what I found really interesting is that rather than just kind of wiping the slate clean and starting a bed over, God continues to engage with humanity.
Right.
Even giving Cain this protective mark after he commits murder.
Right. It's almost as if they're saying that God, knowing the potential for darkness within humanity, still chose to double down on this investment despite the risks.
It's like free will is part of the deal from the very beginning.
Yeah.
And with free will comes the potential for good and bad choices.
Right.
And God knows that going in.
Yeah.
So the author is kind of setting this stage where God is intentionally taking on this risk.
Like exactly.
And then they go on to continue this line of thinking through other key figures in the Bible.
Yeah.
And they even bring up Abraham.
Yes.
Who is so often held up as the model of faith.
Yes, the father of faith.
But they highlight some of his,
they do.
Let's just say, less than perfect moments.
Right.
Which I thought was really fascinating.
Yeah, and I mean, Abraham's story is fascinating because I think it does show this kind of complexity of faith. He's chosen by God. He makes this incredible covenant with him.
Right.
And yet he also exhibits moments of doubt and even deception.
Yeah. The author specifically mentions those times when Abraham lies about his wife Sarah to Pharaoh and then later to Abimelech.
Right.
And it's like they're suggesting that even those who are considered righteous by God are still capable of making mistakes.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point that they're making. They're acknowledging that even God's chosen people aren't immune to weakness and failings,
Right.
And it adds a layer of realism, I think, to the whole concept of faith. It's not always about this unwavering certainty.
Right.
Sometimes it's about trusting God even when we stumble.
I think that really challenges the traditional, almost romanticized view of faith, doesn't it?
It does.
It's not just about arriving at some perfect state of belief. It's about the journey.
I think so. It is about the journey. And I think the author is really trying to push back against that idea that faith is just a static once and for all kind of thing.
Right.
And they're presenting it as this dynamic process.
Yeah.
Something that involves wrestling with doubt, confronting our imperfections.
Right.
And ultimately choosing to trust in God's grace despite all of that.
And this ties right back into their central metaphor of the losing investment.
It does.
It's as if they're saying that God knows we're going to mess up. He knows that we're going to fall short of his expectations.
Right.
But he still chooses to invest in us anyway.
Yeah. And there's a certain paradox, though, that I find really intriguing, because it forces us to kind of grapple with the nature of God's love and grace.
Right.
Why would a perfect being continue to pour out love and mercy on a humanity that consistently seems to fall short?
It's a great question. It's a question that I think has been asked for millennia.
Right.
And it really challenges our understanding of how divine love operates.
Mm-hmm.
Because it doesn't seem to be transactional.
No.
It's not about expecting a certain return on investment.
Right.
It's something much deeper and more unconditional than that.
It is.
And I think it raises some really important questions about what it actually means to be justified by faith.
It does.
So is it about earning God's favor through our good deeds?
Right.
Or is this something else entirely?
Yeah.
I think that's where we need to delve it deeper.
Yeah, we do.
Because the author doesn't stop at just presenting this idea of God's actions as a losing investment. They go on to explore the implications of that perspective.
Right.
And how it ultimately leads to a much more powerful affirmation of God's persistent grace.
Yes, and they use some really vivid imagery and really thought-provoking arguments to do so.
Okay, so this is getting really interesting.
Yeah.
But before we dive into that,
Yep.
I think it's important to kind of unpack this idea of human nature a bit more.
Yeah.
Because it seems like the author has a particularly, well, shall we say, cynical view of humanity's capacity for goodness.
Yes, they do.
So let's talk about that next.
Okay. Yeah, they don't hold back at all. They just come right out and say it. There's not a single righteous person.
Wow.
They're quoting Romans 3.0 there. And they use this, this pretty stark assessment of humanity to argue that God's persistent investment in us seems even more illogical from a purely human perspective.
Yeah, it's like they're saying, okay, well, if we're all so fundamentally flawed, why would God even bother?
Exactly.
It's a good question. And they even go on to compare the human heart to something deceitful above all things and beyond cure. That's pretty harsh. I mean, where's the hope in that?
Well, I think that's precisely the question they want us to wrestle with.
Okay.
By painting such a bleak picture of human nature.
Right.
I think they're setting the stage for a truly profound exploration of God's grace.
No, okay. So they're using this almost exaggerated negativity to highlight the radical nature of God's love.
Exactly. It's like they're saying, look, even if we accept this deeply flawed view of ourselves, even if we believe that we're inherently prone to selfishness and sin, God's love still breaks through.
Okay, that's powerful. But it also seems to create a bit of a dilemma, doesn't it?
It does.
I mean, if we're truly as messed up as the author is suggesting, doesn't that make this whole idea of justification by faith a bit problematic?
Yeah.
How can we be declared righteous in God's eyes if we're constantly falling short?
Right. And the author anticipates this question.
Okay.
And doesn't shy away from the potential pitfalls of the concept.
Yeah.
They even suggest that maybe this idea of justification by faith is just a way to kind of mask our ongoing sinfulness.
Oh, wow. Hold on. So they're actually questioning a core tenet of, many Christian beliefs.
They are, and they back it up with specific examples from the Bible.
Okay.
They bring up the list of sins outlined in Galatians 5.2021.
Okay.
Things like idolatry, hatred, jealousy, fits of rage.
Right.
And they argue that even those who claim to be justified by faith are still struggling with these very real human failings.
So are they saying that justification by faith is basically just a get-out-of-jail-free card? Like we can just believe in God and then go about our lives doing whatever we want?
No, I don't think that's what they're saying. I think they're trying to grapple with that tension between the ideal of righteousness and the reality of human imperfection.
Okay.
They're asking us to consider whether justification by faith is really a static state of being,
right,
or is it an ongoing process of transformation?
I think that makes a lot of sense. It's not about suddenly becoming perfect overnight. Right. It's about recognizing our need for God's grace.
Yeah.
And striving to live in a way that reflects that grace, even when we mess up.
Exactly. And I think that's where the author's analogy of the unjust scales comes into play.
Oh, right. They talk about how no matter how hard we try to balance the scales, our good deeds will never outweigh our flaws in God's eyes.
Right. They use this image to represent that discrepancy between human righteousness and God's perfect standard.
And they bring up Job as a case study.
They do.
Who is considered righteous by God.
Yes.
but still faces immense suffering and questions God's justice.
Right, and it's such a powerful example because Job, even in his righteousness, displays human flaws and doubts.
He even says, let me be weighed on honest scales so that God may see my integrity.
Yeah, he desires to be weighed on those scales of justice in Job 31.6, acknowledging his own limitations.
But the author argues that even someone like Job, who is held up as a model of righteousness, still falls short of God's perfect standard. Okay, so this is starting to feel a little bit hopeless. If even Job falls short, what chance do the rest of us have?
Right, and they use Job's example to question whether any human, even the best of us, can truly meet God's requirements for righteousness on our own merit.
So where does that leave us in terms of this whole justification by faith idea?
Well, that's a great question, and it leads us to, I think, a really crucial turning point in the author's line of reasoning.
Okay.
Because despite this seemingly bleak outlook on humanity, they ultimately acknowledge that God continues to pour grace and love into us, even when it seems like a bad investment.
It's like they're saying that even though God knows we're going to make mistakes, he can't help but keep investing in us.
Yeah, it's a powerful image. And actually, the author kind of shifts their analogy here.
Okay.
They move away from the financial language, and they use a different comparison.
Okay.
Instead of talking about, a quick, unsatisfying meal, they liken God's investment in us to savoring a Wagyu steak.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Something that requires time and patience and careful attention to fully appreciate.
So that's a pretty drastic shift.
It is.
It suggests a level of care and intentionality that goes way beyond just a simple financial transaction.
Right. It speaks to the idea that God isn't just looking for a quick return on his investment.
Yeah.
He's committed to the long game.
Right.
To a slow and transformative process of growth and refinement.
So it's not about achieving some kind of instant perfection.
No.
But it's about embracing the journey, the ups and downs, the gradual unfolding of God's grace in our lives.
Exactly. And they point to the Apostle Paul's letters as evidence of this.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
He consistently emphasizes God's grace and love, even when he's addressing the shortcomings and the struggles of the early Christians.
It's like Paul understood that becoming more Christ-like is a journey, not a destination.
Right.
And that God is with us every step of the way, offering us grace upon grace, even when we stumble.
Yeah. And that grace isn't something we earn or deserve. It's a free gift, offered freely to all who choose to receive it.
And this brings to mind that parable of the lost sheep, which I think the author connects to this idea of God's persistent grace.
Yeah, that parable beautifully illustrates God's willingness to seek out and value even one lost soul, no matter the cost. It shows us that God's love isn't conditional on our performance or our ability to measure up to some standard of righteousness.
It's a love that pursues us.
Yes.
Even when we're lost and wandering.
Yes.
And rejoices when we're found.
It does.
That's beautiful. That's really beautiful.
It's a radical concept when you really think about it.
It is.
It goes against our kind of human understanding of fairness and reciprocity.
Yeah. You get what you deserve.
Right.
But that's not how God operates.
Not at all.
So even though the author started with this provocative idea of God making a losing investment, they ultimately seem to arrive at a much deeper and more hopeful understanding of God's grace.
They do, and I think that's one of the most compelling aspects of their argument. Yeah. They don't shy away from the difficult questions, the doubts, the complexities of faith.
Yeah.
But they ultimately lead us to, I think, a place of profound affirmation of God's love and mercy.
It's like they're saying that God's love isn't bound by the rules of our earthly economy. It's an outpouring of grace and mercy that just defies human logic and calculation.
It does. It defies human logic.
So this raises a lot of interesting questions about how we view our own relationship with God. If we let go of this idea of earning his favor, of constantly striving to measure up, what does that freedom allow us to do? How does it change our understanding of faith and grace?
Those are great questions, and I think they point to the heart of what the author is trying to convey.
Okay.
This isn't just an intellectual exercise.
Right.
It's an invitation to experience God's grace in a new and transformative way.
Wow, so we've really gone on quite a journey with this deep dive, haven't we?
We have.
From this provocative idea of God's actions as a losing investment to this really beautiful affirmation of his persistent grace.
Yeah, it's been a fascinating exploration of this central theological concept, and I think the author's very unconventional approach has really helped us to see justification by faith in a whole new light.
I completely agree. By using these bold analogies and really pushing us to confront these complexities of human nature, they've given us this whole new way of understanding God's love and mercy.
Right, they force us to grapple with that tension, between our human tendency towards sin and God's unwavering commitment to our redemption.
And I think that's where the real power of this perspective lies. It doesn't shy away from those difficult questions. It doesn't offer easy answers or simplistic solutions.
Right, it invites us to kind of engage in this deeper, more nuanced conversation about the nature of faith, grace, and our relationship with the divine.
So to recap, we started by exploring this idea of God's actions as a losing investment, which the author used to highlight humanity's shortcomings and question our worthiness of God's grace.
Yeah.
And then we delved into their analysis of these biblical figures like Cain and Abel and Abraham and even Job, using their stories to kind of challenge these traditional interpretations of faith and righteousness.
Right.
And through it all, I think we arrived at this really profound understanding of God's persistent grace.
Yes.
This love that transcends human logic and continues to pour into our lives even when we fall short.
Even when we fall short, a love that's not deterred by our failures or our inability to perfectly reflect his righteousness.
Yeah, and it just leaves us with a lot to ponder.
That does.
What does it actually mean for us if God's love is truly this unconditional and unwavering?
Yeah, what does it mean for us? I think this deep dive has really challenged us to rethink our assumptions about faith and grace.
I think so too.
Pushing us to confront this tension between human imperfection and divine love. It's given us a lot to think about. I hope this has given you a lot to think about too.
It certainly has for me. Thanks for bringing this to my attention. It's been a really, really fascinating conversation.
It has. Thank you.